Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar focusing on managing heat stress in layers. The first of our three speakers today is Dr. Ian Rubinoff. For those of you that don't know, Ian is the Director of Global Technical Services and has been at Highline for 12 years. His work included disease management, production, and biosecurity. Additionally, Ian gives presentations on these topics at seminars, universities, and scientific forums. Today's topic will consider the impact heat stress can have on the health and profitability of laying flocks, along with management advice to help mitigate the effects, including guidance on ventilation from the industry expert we have as a guest speaker today, Justin Emery. I'd now like to hand you over to Ian, who will be our host and MC for questions. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the Science and Challenge of Heat Stress. Today, we are going to do a quick refresher on the science, definition, and physiology of heat stress. I wanted to start today with just defining and understanding what constitutes heat stress. Heat stress for poultry is a combination of temperature and humidity. You could see with the blue section, this is the threshold for what constitutes normal temperature into what would constitute heat stress. We can see that the higher the humidity, the lower the temperature has to be for us to get into a heat stress situation. We can have as low as 22 degrees with 75% humidity for us to be considered in an alert situation for heat stress. The next threshold for danger can be 34 degrees with low humidity, or as low as 28 degrees or 26 degrees with high humidity. When we start getting into the red area, or the emergency, this is where we need to make sure that all of our management techniques, which will be discussed later in this webinar, have been enacted in order for us to help avoid the stress on the birds. When we are working with chickens, we must consider that the normal body temperature is 41 to 42 degrees centigrade. For chickens to stay at a normal temperature, they always have to balance the metabolic heat that is produced from their body with the normal heat loss. When temperatures are high, the heat loss from the body due to the higher environmental levels of heat becomes more difficult. I wanted to show a quick example of farms that I work with here in Iowa during the hot period. As you can see, this is a 2-week stretch just this month during July. And we can see we have two different houses. We have a normal tunnel house, and we have a house that's has cool pads for further cooling. The black line here is our environmental temperature, and this is the high average during the day. You can see that most of the days reached above 30 degrees, with the beginning of this time period reaching 35 degrees. The temperature in just the tunnel house fairly closely mirrors what the environmental temperature is, with several days being even warmer than the outside temperature, although this may be due to some other factors as well, including the sunlight and the humidity. Whereas our cool pad house, with the blue temperatures, is very consistent, with almost every day only getting up to about 28 degrees, even during the hottest of temperatures. This is critical for helping to manage chickens during the hottest weather. When chickens are faced with high heat stress, they have a physiologic response. And the main reason that this is important is because this will impact the shell quality, this will impact the immune system, and this will also potentially cause mortality events if the heat gets bad enough. The most important components of this include the increased respiration, because chickens do not sweat, but they try to pant to cool down. And when they pant, they cause a respiratory alkalosis because of a reduction in carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. This reduction in carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, as we'll see in a few slides, is primarily responsible for the challenge with shell quality. All of these other physiological responses all work together to create a challenge situation for the bird that, if we do not manage it with ventilation and management, will create drops in production or increases in mortality. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about how birds thermoregulate themselves. As mentioned, chickens do not sweat, so instead they try to spread their wings like this to increase the airflow to the blood vessels that are close to the surface underneath their wings. They will pant to try to create an evaporative cooling. They will try to go to a cooler part of the house, where if they're in a floor range area, they will try to get close to the floor, get on the cement, or get into the dust. They will also increase the blood flow to the external parts of the area, such as the comb and wattles. Scientifically, there are 4 ways that heat gets transferred. And of these, birds typically use 3 of them to try to stay cool. The first way, through radiation. We saw this in the previous slide by the birds increasing the airflow over their wings by lifting their wings up. We have the conduction. This is where the chickens would get down onto the floor or try to move to a cooler part of the house. The convection, which would be how we might cool down the house using the natural airflow, is not something that chickens would primarily use. But then we have evaporation, which the chickens would work on by panting. For our last slide today, I wanted to discuss the relationship between heat stress and shell quality. When birds are panting, they are releasing more carbon dioxide into the air, and there's less carbon dioxide in their bloodstream. Carbon dioxide is a critical component of carbonic acid, which is in the blood. This carbonic acid, which exists in this formula, is critical to the creation of calcium carbonate, which the hen uses to make the shell. As we lose this carbon dioxide and we reduce our carbonic acid in the blood, we also have to deal with the fact that hens are probably eating a little bit less, and they do not have as much calcium in their bloodstream and in their digestive tract. We deal with a combination of low calcium in the bloodstream from the feed, low carbonic acid in the bloodstream because of panting, and that combination will lead to less calcium available to make a strong shell. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the webinar.
So next we have Dr. Greg Selliers. He is a global veterinarian for Highline International. He's been with us for 2 years now, and we are very happy to have him share his presentation on management during periods of hot weather.
Thank you for that introduction. I will be discussing with you the management of birds during periods of hot weather. Let us start by having a look at these 4 interventions that we can make, that we can use when it is getting warm inside the poultry house. Ventilation adjustment, ensuring quality water and supply, feed and nutrition management, and overall environmental management. But first and most importantly, every intervention that we are going to make will be in response and tailored to the observed bird behavior. Indications that the birds are getting warm is that they start gasping and panting, In fact, panting respiration can be as high as 250 breaths per minute. What the bird is doing here is mediating evaporative cooling from the surface of her lungs. Up to 80% of the heat loss is in fact through this behavior. They will spread their wings to increase the airflow over their body, and as the heat stress progresses, they become slow and lethargic, eventually ending in a stupor. They might stagger around, and you could see terminal convulsions. So behavior is our indicator of bird comfort. So when this type of behavior is observed, your first priority should be to increase ventilation. Check and adjust the set point temperatures if needed. Remember, the fans will start and increase airflow only when the internal house temperature exceeds the set point. Airflow at the bird's level is key to removing heat. This can be difficult to achieve and limiting in an aviary or a cage system, as the system itself offers interference to the airflow. For that reason, no unnecessary obstructions should be in the house that will further obstruct the airflow. Dust and cobwebs, things that we often find in a chicken house at the air inlets or the fan outlets, restrict the flow and should be removed. Make sure that all the fans are operational and serviced regularly, and that the house is sealed as best as possible to maintain a negative pressure. I took the following video on a farm visit in Mozambique, and originally I thought that the fan belt had stretched, but on closer observation you will see that it is the motor which has shifted. So it is just the alignment of the fan and the motor, but as a result of this, the fan is not moving the volume of air that it should be moving, and you can see this by the angle of the louvers outside. Wet pads allow air that is pulled into the house to be cooled through evaporative cooling. These pads should be cleaned or replaced when they become clogged, or otherwise they simply lose function. The air will not be cooled, and the air flow into the house will be restricted. The only limitation with wet pads is humidity. Evaporative cooling uses heat from the air to vaporize water, and yes, this lowers the temperature, but at the same time increases humidity. So for this reason, they should only be used when the relative humidity is below 75%. Fogging systems reduce air temperature with the same evaporative cooling as wet walls. The foggers inject fine water particles into the air, and as the water vaporizes, heat is absorbed from the air, lowering its effective temperature. When foggers are used, they should be operated intermittently to avoid excessive water flow into the house and the environment. Fogging systems in naturally ventilated houses are typically designed for a water flow rate of around 200 to 300 liters per hour. For tunnel ventilated houses, a guideline can be used of 3.5 liters per 30 cubic meters per minute. A pressure of 200 psi is preferred. After all, we want to create a fine mist and not a garden sprinkler in the chicken house. To get the best out of your fogging systems, you should be using them in combination with your ventilation system. And the correct setup will evaporate all of the water before it exits the house. Ventilation is not only restricted by equipment and objects in the house, but also by the birds themselves. So stocking density will affect how the birds are able to cool themselves during periods of hot weather. Ensure that your birds are evenly spread. Create pens if you need to, but make sure that the access to feed and water is evenly distributed within this space. This picture was taken when we were forced to hold pullets back on a rearing farm due to avian influenza, and the farm was quarantined. But luckily it was winter. If this had been summer, we would have been in for all sorts of trouble. A bird's water to feed consumption ratio is normally 2:1 at around 21 degrees centigrade. At 38 degrees centigrade, it increases to 8:1. So drinking water must be available to heat-stressed birds in the amounts that they require. To achieve this, your drinkers must have sufficient water flow. For nipples, that is in the region of around 70 mils per minute. Access to drinkers is important, both in space but as well as in height. For floor-reared flocks, additional drinkers can be provided. Clogged water filters will restrict the water flow to the chicken house, so check the water filters and change them if necessary. Cooler water will help reduce the bird's core temperature. Not only this, but birds prefer to drink water below 25 degrees centigrade. Water temperatures above 30 degrees centigrade, the birds simply refuse to drink. So flush the lines regularly, particularly in the afternoon hours. Provide insulation or shade for water tanks, for water pipes on the farm. And avoid dark colors that attract heat. I had a client in Botswana that used to take buckets of water, mix in a stress pack, and freeze these buckets in preparation for hot days. And on the hot day, they used to take out these giant ice blocks basically and throw them into the header tanks. Not only did it cool the water, but they got the stress pack in at the same time. So talking about stress pack, you can add electrolytes and vitamins to your flock's drinking water. Heat stress causes increased loss of several minerals, including potassium, sodium, phosphorus, magnesium, and zinc. Potassium chloride electrolytes in particular appear to increase the water intake when provided in the drinking water at 0.6% concentration. Vitamin C, we know, will help reduce egg production drops and also poor eggshell quality. Ideally, you want to be providing this sort of supplementation prior to the heat stress period. So in the below diagram, I would be treating the birds on the Friday already, before the spike in temperature. I think by now it has been well established that feed intakes are reduced with warm temperatures. And here is a nice graph that was put together depicting the reduced feed intake during a period of heat stress in the US. Because feed intakes are reduced, it is critical that you formulate accordingly. Adjust the nutrient density of the diet to the predicted reduction in feed intake. The energy density should not be increased. Increasing energy density can have the effect of reducing feed intake and thereby reducing the intake of the other key nutrients. Try to minimize excess protein in the diet. The reason here is that excess nitrogen intake places an additional metabolic burden on an already stressed bird. So you really want to be formulating to the digestible nutrient requirements for the bird, ensuring that there is an ideal amino acid profile being maintained. In one of the Friends episodes, Joey comments, "Here come the meat sweats," after polishing a turkey that I think Monica had prepared. Metabolic heat production from digestion is a real thing. So why would we want to be feeding our birds over midday? Aim to feed them in the early morning and allow them to clean the troughs up late over midday, and feed them only again in the late afternoon, perhaps near sunset. In addition to this kind of practice, midnight feeding is an excellent way to compensate for low feed intakes. If we look at feed additives, potassium chloride, ammonium chloride, sodium bicarbonate, these can replace electrolytes lost during heat stress. These treatments reduce mortality and help restore the acid-base balance. Phytogenic feed additives are becoming more and more popular in diets as they exert an anti-inflammatory and even antioxidant effect in the birds, which aid in stabilizing the gut. We all know that birds can be picky eaters, and one way around this would be to pellet the diet. The trick with pelleting feed, though, is to get a pellet of satisfactory quality. You want to aim for a minimum of 90% durability and ensure that the pellet length is not too long, around 4 to 5 millimeters. Wetting the feed is another trick to increase feed intake, but it should be managed. You do not want to leave wet feed in the feed troughs. Run those feeders frequently. This might mean that you will need to manage the feed hopper levels more carefully, but the sound of a running chain or moving gantry will encourage the birds to come and investigate. Let's move on to the environment. Don't reduce the litter depth. Stay with a 5 centimeter bedding material because this is going to be needed to absorb the increased water expulsion from the birds as well as the water spillage during hot weather. Having insulation in the roof is the best way to reduce heat radiation, and you can also consider things like painting the outside a color that would reflect heat. Sprinklers can be placed on the outside of the roof to spray onto the top, and that will also remove heat. Circulating fans inside, yes, they do work. I often get into this argument with producers, but the key is really the placement of these fans. In an open-sided house, the fan should be orientated to blow air diagonally across the house. Automated curtains and side shade cloths will decrease the sun exposure into the house. Side shade cloths must not, however, restrict the ventilation. There should be enough space that the air can still move freely into and out of the house. If your birds are on the range, if they are ranging outside, then provide shade for them on the range. Some other quick tips: test your temperature alarms and emergency ventilation equipment. Have a plan in place that the staff need to do and should a ventilation failure occur. And train your staff members so that they are familiar with the plan. Remember that ventilation during hot weather is not only limited to daytime. Adjust the fan thermostats so that all the fans run continuously during the night and early morning hours. The goal here is to maximize your nighttime cooling in the house and prolong the period of moderate temperatures the next morning. And put a hold on any bird handlings. Management practices which require handlings of the birds, such as beak trimming or transport vaccinations, should be postponed or scheduled for early morning. As an incentive to make all of these interventions, I've done a quick calculation of what 1 week of hot weather and 1 week's recovery might cost you. I've used a 16,000 flock at placement, now 49 weeks of age. They're on standard, so their egg weight at the moment should be around 64 grams, and the egg price that I got was 90.74 pence per dozen. So in this situation, I have assumed a 20% cumulative production drop, 5% cumulative extra cracks and seconds that come through, 2% mortality, it was quite nasty, and a conservative egg weight drop of 64 grams to 63 grams. This gives us a total direct loss of 555 pounds for that 2-week period. If you had to then go in and factor that we are now sitting 313 birds short and their potential production loss up to 75 weeks, we get another 3,574 pounds worth of potential income that was lost. In summary, the key to minimizing effects of heat stress are anticipating periods of high environmental temperatures, implementing appropriate management and nutritional measures prior to the rise in temperatures, and adjusting your interventions according to bird behavior. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. That was an excellent presentation and a very nice summary of what we can do for hot weather management. I want to just say welcome to our industry expert, Justin Emery. Justin is currently the co-director of Draper Care, which is part of the Draper Group and a senior ventilation consultant. Ventilation is always one of the most fascinating components of heat management, and I'm very excited to see what Justin can share with us today about this topic. Justin, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, my name is Justin Emery. You might have had an introduction previously to me and my background, but just to reiterate, I was Basically grew up on broiler breeder farm, and that was my first sort of excursion into the industry. I've even worked on free range farms more years ago than I care to remember, on old flat decks. But then I transitioned into ADAS, where I became a poultry ventilation expert, as well as dealing with generalities of poultry husbandry. But as a ventilation expert, I had the great pleasure of working with people like Dr. David Charles and Nick Lynn, and a lot of other people who basically set out the foundations of what is ventilation systems as we see them today. And they did that at places like Silsoe Research Station, where the government paid for pure research to be done. And a lot of the parameters established there still apply very much today, but unfortunately, in many cases, they've been forgotten about in ventilation companies. And I'm very thankful for Highline for letting me talk to you today about heat stress. Since my speciality has been mostly with broilers, heat stress in that sector of the industry tends unfortunately to lead to mortality, which is obviously the ultimate welfare insult to a bird. On the laying side of the industry, where the birds are lower stocking rates and they are adults, they tend not to die, but they do suffer from other welfare related incidents just through being too hot. And a lot of it you will notice as farmers or managers as loss of production, for example. But it's still, heat stress is still a welfare problem. Now, new folk to the industry have had a lot of issues where they say, well, if we get a welfare insult, so especially this occurs on the broiler side, where they'll say, well, that's all right, the insurance will pick it up. That I don't think is acceptable. There are objective parameters which we can apply to ventilation systems to make them right. And I think that's what, going forward, we should try and do. And without sort of having spoilers, if there's a take-home message from today, it will be airspeed and enough air change to make that airspeed. A lot of the problems that we get sometimes with ventilation design in houses which you'll be managing is because sometimes on the continent there is a perception that the UK is a cool, temperate climate. Now, the majority of what we get as weather patterns occur in these two areas, what they call polar maritime and tropical maritime. That is basically air coming over the Atlantic and raining all over Wales and the rest of England. You get the polar, which is from the northwest, which is cold air going over warm seas, and the southwest, perhaps where it's warm air going over colder seas. And the bottom line is we get rain and clouds and sometimes some sunshine. Occasionally in the middle of winter, you get these polar continentals which are blocking highs, and that can get temperatures down to -18. It has been recorded. I've personally seen that on a farm. On the other hand, what we're talking about today in terms of hot weather is we can get tropical continental weather. That's what a lot of Europe gets. You can get a blocking high pressure system which originates perhaps in the Azores, North Africa, and that's where we can get warm weather, 39 degrees. And there's going to be a hot weather event, they reckon, this weekend even. So we do get warm weather, and I think if we go back through go back through the records, certainly since 2010, there's not been a week where we haven't experienced over 30 degrees in the UK. So we have hot weather, and we need to be making and designing and being aware of this when we in our poultry houses. And again, unfortunately, I don't think it happens. Now, there is law about heat management. There's the Welfare of Farmed Animal Regulations 2010, and it is very, very broad brush. There are a few annexes which define considerably more, but basically it says ventilation should be there and should be sufficient to avoid overheating. When you look at that, that's very, very broad brush. But heat stress, essentially, you could argue, is overheating, and it occurs when the birds have difficulty in achieving a balance between body heat production and the heat loss. And heat loss, of course, is areas where it can conduct heat or convection occurs and it can take heat away that way, or it radiates heat. But bottom line is you need a ventilation system and you need air movement over it. The manual heat stress in poultry, solving the problem, is a good little booklet, still very, very relevant today. I know it seems to be mostly aimed at broiler industries, again, because, and this was actually written after 2003, August 2003, when we had our records of 38 degrees then, and unfortunately the industry lost a lot of birds. It was written after that. And the whole purpose of it is to again promote this idea of air speed and how to manage birds. You should have it hopefully on your farms. It's well worth a read. We know, because the research has been done, what the heat output of a laying hen is. And that is important in calculating ventilation rates. I'm going with a bit of background here, mainly because you need to sort of have an understanding of the objectives, the objective facts behind hot weather ventilation. A laying hen's output from this research here, for example, shows quite clearly that we can have birds around 6.5, 6.2, 6.5, 6.5. We can have heat outputs of around 6.5, perhaps to 7 watts per kilo of bird. So that means with a 2 kilo bird you could have anywhere from 13 to 15 watts of heat output. This graph here is actually from a broiler set, from broilers, but the principles are very similar and the outputs are very, very similar. And so for a 16,000 hen house we can have up to 160 to 180 kilowatts of heat. Sensible heat is called, that needs to be removed. That's sensible heat is heat that can be recorded by a thermometer essentially. We have to remove that, and so we design our ventilation systems accordingly. Why? There are also, obviously, since we know that we've got objective heat outputs, we also have heat equations, and this is designed again to work out ventilation rate. You don't have to know the equations, but it's enough to know that they exist. The ventilation is a whole combination of the heat output, which shows the sensible heat output of birds here, solar radiation penetration, thermal transmittance through the walls, the surface area, the specific heat capacity of air. All of these things tie in to making an equation. And this equation ends up, and it was something developed by ADAS and others, here you can see it, and it actually can give you an output per bird. So for example, a typical hen house ought to be, for layers, ought to be between 9 and 10 cubic meters per hour per hen. So that turns out, again, for 16,000 birds, about 144 to 160,000 cubic meters per hour of air. A simple rule should be we're about 10. I think the industry is actually much less than that. And also it actually occurs with trying to get a lift in the house of only 3 degrees. Now, basically, that means that if, in ideal conditions, if it was 25 degrees outside, the average internal temperature, in theory, will be 28 degrees. A 3 degree lift. You can't have it cold and outside. If it's cold and outside, there's something wrong with your outside temperature thermometer. That's unless you've got some sort of artificial cooling system. But basically, you're trying to keep your air temperatures within a certain temperature lift relative to outside temperature. And a lot of ventilation systems, where they're light, the theoretical calculation is, for example, 5 degrees. That's not really enough to generate enough airspeed, enough air change. On the other hand, if you go beyond 3 degrees, you're starting to spend a disproportionate amount of money on fans. 3 degrees has always been, within the UK from way, way back, in the 50s and 60s, is the number we tend to run to. And that will result in ventilation rates of 9 to 10 cubic meters per hour per bird. Bottom line is we're here to try and ensure that our houses are as relevant as possible for as long as possible. So anyone doing a new design ought to be looking at hot weather ventilation seriously, and how to get that air movement and air change through the house. But of course we know with free on the egg laying sector, that we have two issues essentially, and it's the same with broilers, that's litter condition and keeping them alive in hot weather. They seem to be two ends of it. Now, in the broiler industry, the houses tend to be defined not necessarily by who built them, whether it's Moorespan or Powell's or someone else like that. It tends to be defined by the ventilation system. Oh, I put Climatec in, or I put a Scott system, or I put McKenna or Fancom, or I put Draper in. That tends to be the definition, and you sort of know then that they're talking about a ventilation system. On the egg laying side of the industry, what we tend to talk about is the nest system. So I put a Janssen or Potters, a Venco, a Big Dutchman. And that doesn't talk to what the ventilation system does at all. You don't know what you've got. You don't really know the specifications. I actually have been into sort of valleys in Wales sometimes where you have exactly the same nest system, but in farms side by side, but a completely different ventilation design. And when you ask the question, why is that the case? Short answer is they don't know. And I don't really know why they were sold what they were sold. I don't really know what the design philosophy behind it was. But what is essential is that the house needs to be able to do a winter ventilation system as well as a good summer ventilation. Sometimes we don't get both. You might have a very good summer ventilation system, but a very compromised winter ventilation system. And I'm afraid, again, I've seen an awful lot of that. What we're trying to get to is one that can do both. Now, before we actually get on again and have a look at actual ventilation itself, we need to understand something about how the hen appreciates hot weather. Hens, broilers, whichever you like, use evaporation. It's called the latent heat, but they use evaporation from their lungs to cool in hot weather predominantly. Humans tend to use air temperature, just losing it through conduction, radiation, convection, etc. We do sweat a bit, yes, and that's what feels cool when we sweat, but mostly we're sensible heat loss, not so much evaporative heat loss. Broilers and hens are the other way around. That means they don't feel the heat in the same way as we do, and we always have to be careful about assuming that because we might feel nice, a hen might feel comfy in the same situation. They quite often don't. They're far more tied into what the temperature-humidity relationship is doing. So if we take it a step further, for example, we might say that a hen has to lose 20 watts of total heat. That's evaporative and sensible heat. Let's say it has to lose 20 watts of heat. It's a realistic number. It partitions how it loses that heat. For example, here we have 21 degrees centigrade and 50% RH. And you can see quite a big proportion of orange here, which is the sensible heat loss. That's losing it down to the environment in a way, and this is this panting heat loss. So it's panting, a fair deal, it's losing heat without having to work hard, it's not having to do anything to lose that heat, and it's coping quite well. Let's say we go up to 25 degrees now. That big 25 degrees, that's a warmer air temperature, so it loses less of its body heat through sensible heat loss. And then a higher proportion of it has to go through panting. So that bird's having to work hard now to pant, to lose heat. It's still coping, but you can see that it's majoring now on evaporative cooling. Again, so if we take that a step further, these two are sort of basically a rerun of the previous two slides where 21 degrees, 25 degrees, 50% RH. You've got a constant RH here, constant humidity. But let's say we get up to 30 degrees centigrade and 50% RH still. You have an even lower heat loss through sensible heat loss. And because there's a high temperature and a relatively high humidity, there's a lot of moisture in the air now, these birds are less able to pant into that high humidity. So what we have is a poor sensible heat loss and a compromised evaporative heat loss. Now those birds then start to get into deficit, and when they get into deficit, that's when we start to see heat stress. And the other colleagues here will be talking probably about how what the impacts of those are. But we are losing the ability to get total heat control of the heat loss there. So that 25% deficit becomes the important issue. Transition. Now, if we take it again a step further, we can have here, for example, constant temperature, but an increasing relative humidity. And just as we were shown before, right, constant temperature means you get a constant, sensible heat loss, but the efficiency with which they can pant into the air starts to come down. And as the relative humidity increases, we tend to get a larger and larger deficit in their ability to lose heat, and that bird then becomes increasingly heat stressed. You can also see that when you have high humidities, this is the limitation to some misting systems, in that if you get too high humidity, the bird is unable to pant into that air. Typically, of course, I've just put a picture of a thunderstorm there. That can occur when it gets very, very hot and humid. I mentioned at the beginning, in a sense of spoilers, that airspeed is one of the crucial parts about alleviating heat stress. This little chart here shows that as airspeed along the bottom increases, you will see that although in this particular circumstance, this bird is coping, it's getting rid of all its heat. But what it's doing when the airspeed increases is far more of its heat loss is sensible heat loss. It means it doesn't have to do anything to lose that heat. And its panting then just becomes less stress. It doesn't have to pant so hard to achieve its cooling, to achieve all its heat loss. That means that bird is far better off. It's not going to become dehydrated and all the other things associated with high metabolic rates and high breathing rates. So airspeed becomes key. It really does give that bird a capacity to cope in hot weather. Also, with increasing airspeed on this is a graph of core body temperature up the side here versus airspeed along the bottom. Again, it's done on a broiler at 30 degrees centigrade, but the same principle applies. That broiler had a high core body temperature at low air speeds. It just wasn't getting wind chill. So it was having to breathe into quite a humid environment around its head because the hair wasn't being removed away. Its body temperature was coming up to probably a place where that bird might die. Increase the airspeed, and around sort of 1 to 1.5 meters per second, that core body temperature dropped dramatically, much closer to its normal temperature of 41 approximately. And more importantly as well, or just as importantly, sorry, its breaths per minute have gone down from 150 breaths per minute down to 20 breaths per minute. And that again means there's much less muscle activity. And again, as it says here, high respiration rates, that heartbeat, the actual sort of use of muscles can create alkalosis. It's also creating internal body heat. It changes the blood-body chemistry centrally to the bird. So again, air speeds, and not only they're better for panting, it encourages higher sensible heat loss. We're also bringing the core body temperature down, and we're bringing down its respiration rate as well. All for benefit of. If we look at the actual ventilation patterns which we typically get in the hands, if we go for a traditional flat deck with a sidewall system, this is a sidewall inlet system and a ridge extraction system. The airstream produced is an indirect pattern. That basically means that the air comes in at the side and we've got no pop holes open. We've just got negative pressure, which means the air is being sucked out by the fans. We get if it's all designed right, we have a fast air speed coming in from the inlets. It travels up the ceiling. It starts to slow down, but what you do is get a clean rotation across the floor, and the airspeed back across the floor is quite smooth. It's not turbulent, and you get a benefit of a wind speed over that bird. And we're looking for wind speeds. That's what we're getting. That's a typical flat deck indirect system. If we take the flame flat deck, but we fully open the inlets, there can be problems with some sidewall inlet designs where some of the air now goes directly over the birds, and you think that is good, but a lot of the air also goes up the ceiling. Unfortunately, what happens in these circumstances, and there's a lot of houses like it, is that as air goes up the ceiling and as air goes across the floor, it disturbs the rotation that we saw in the previous slide. We don't get a nice, even and smooth rotation. We have turbulence in the middle. Now, so whilst the birds near the wall might feel very happy, the ones in the middle probably don't, and because the air has slowed down and you have turbulence. There might be excessive panting. Again, on the layer side, you won't possibly get mortality in the broiler system if these are on the floor, or we've seen plenty of problems with mortality in the middle of the house because of this turbulent airflow. So it's not something which I'd be recommending. What you would do in this situation is try and deflect the air off the floor. So instead of all the air going up the ceiling, you don't want a halfway house, you want all the air going to the floor, and that's the way to get a good rotation and good movement over the floor. So we open the equivalent actually of what I was just saying in the previous slides is if the pop holes are open. What tends to happen then is you get a nice straight flow right across the birds, right from here, right across the birds and up into the fans, and you do get a rotation back down the ceiling. But to get this correct, it's quite important actually to close the air inlets. If you close the inlets, you will get a good rotation. And if you ever put smoke in there, not you probably would birds in, but you will get you will actually see smoke coming back down the ceiling and entraining into the airstream. So you get a rotation across the floor. Now that is a really good system to have. And so in hot weather, and assuming the other side of the house is exactly the same, you'll get a very nice airflow through that system, assuming you've got enough fans and ventilation to do the job as specified earlier. And again, we come back to this old problem is you need to have enough, and unfortunately, we've got to get the specifications right. For these buildings, and it's something which I think if you're a new builds and going forward, you need to ask that question. In this particular design, for example, here's a house where pop holes are on one side. You've got two rows of sidewall inlets. You've got one here, one there. On this side, you can see it there, but one here, one there. What you have though, with the roof-mounted fans, is you've got essentially, when the pop holes are open, a short circuit. Short air comes straight through here and out of the fans. Very little now, because air takes the path of least resistance. Very little will come through these inlets. These inlets down this wall, because it's all coming through through these pop holes. What happens in here, in hot weather, you get a lot of, you'll get a greatly elevated temperature profile in there. Again, not particularly good. You won't be generating enough airspeed to ventilate these properly. So this house has a problem with a bias of air to one side. Again, in terms of heat stress, that's not beneficial for the birds. How would you do something about that? It's very difficult. Probably the only thing you can do in this circumstance is to put maybe in some internal recirculation to try and get a bit of air movement. The temperature is going to be elevated, but that's what you might do. Or you have to go and put in some supplementary gable fans, perhaps to try and promote a little bit of tunnel down there. But again, unfortunately, even with gable fans in, you're still going to have a bias towards the pop hole sides. But if there's enough down there, you might get some tunnel system going on in that house. And if we go to the multi-tier houses, of course, this shows, as it were, a mirror image. When half the house would have got one system here, there might be a mirror image with another system on the other side with an aisle down the middle. The same rotation pattern applies as to the flat deck. The air will go up the ceiling and will rotate back and it'll come under the system, and you actually do get reasonable rotation on these houses. The big problem can occur though is if this system gets too high to the ceiling and air can't usefully get over the top in hot weather. If you get a restriction there, you will have a problem with airflows in the middle of the house. Now this actually on these systems tends to happen summer and winter. You can get a problem with airflows in the middle of the house just because of this being too high to the ceiling, and you tend to get a rotation of air in the middle. Again, if we go, I don't know what I've got. Again, if you open the pop holes, you will get a straight run, usually through the system and out, and you will get this backtrack. Again, you need to close the inlets. So the same, you do get the same flow patterns through if you open up the pop holes on these houses. And they can be quite successful. And again, if you have even one big unit in the middle with an aisle perhaps down the middle, again, it is possible to get some degree of air movement in the middle. But air does like paths of least resistance. It will see this as a big block in the way, and it will try and find ways of getting the easiest way around it. So again, sidewall systems can work in these circumstances. They are a bit compromised in the winter weather. They can work again in the summer weather as long as long as there is enough air change, put enough airspeed through. A lot of the ways that, sorry if I cut off, a lot of the ways that we can get around the issues of potholes being open is the use sometimes of tunnel ventilation systems or tunnel techniques into these houses. A lot of houses now have chimneys as air intakes down the middle of the house. Sometimes they're passive, which means they have no fans in. Sometimes they have fans in, which means they're actively blowing air in as well. If this was a house that was shut up, so for example the birds aren't old enough to go outside, there's an AAI incident or whatever it is, they're shut up. If you need to use maximum ventilation, then the air comes through the air inlets, these big round circles, and produces a distribution pattern locally there. This is what you get without the tunnel system on in other times of the year. And all the fans are at one end pulling air out. So they're creating a good deal of negative pressure. We get some air coming through the chimneys. But what we need to do, if it gets very warm, is have a supplementary inlet. So we have a tunnel inlet which brings air straight down the lister area to the end fans. That creates a nice air movement, and some of it will go straight down the middle. If this was what I've drawn it as a single system, even if it was a double system, two-row system, you would still get air going nicely down the end and out the fans. Now the tunnel system does work well as a hot weather system. Again, you always have to be careful that it's not being compromised by a poor winter weather or system that works the whole rest of the time. For example, when the potholes open, we still have the same negative pressure, but of course the air is now coming in the potholes, and it supplements to an extent the tunnel vents. You tend to find that because all the air is coming through the side inlets now, especially if these are passive inlets, you get a much reduced inlet velocity coming through the chimneys in the roof. Again, that shouldn't matter if a proper tunnel is working, again, under its negative pressure. What happens if you have potholes on one side only? Well, again, what you tend to do is you will tend to get a bit of a bias of air movement to one side, so there will be a bias of air going towards the end fans from the pothole side, and this is again where it's important to have a tunnel ventilation system. Otherwise, how do you ventilate air, or how do you get air down the non-pothole side? If we went back to that picture we showed of the flat deck where it's got potholes on one side, the same thing would happen here. You would get a lot of still air on this side. The birds probably might choose just to move away from it because it'll get reasonably warm otherwise in that. But you can't always rely on that. You must try and avoid their heat stress for them by them moving away. You can also just redesign the house. That would help. So here's a house with potholes down one side. In the winter, what you do is you get, unfortunately, a lot of short circuiting to the fans and warm areas over here. Fans, for example, across the other side of the house, what we have is air that then can move across the house. It's good for winter work, because the air moves across to the warm side of the house. And in summer, we still have benefit a little bit of tunnel ventilation, but the air is moving across to these fans as well as to the end. So we ventilate this side better. So you get a winter effect benefit and you get a summer benefit. So little things that you can do. Design modification. Sorry if I got cut off on the end of that. So those are just saying things you can do to modify houses. A lot of people have natural ventilation building. Natural ventilation is essentially what they call convection driven. It's the basic stack effect, they call it. And stack effect is essentially just high chimneys. it uses the difference between the height of the inlet, say for example here or down here, and the outlet. The greater the difference, the better the flow rates, basically. And that's what you see here essentially. If you have an inlet system which is predominantly up at the eaves, you will have, it might be okay for wind to work a little bit, air will go up and out of the ceiling, but it generates not a lot of movement down on the floor here. If you have a big difference, then you can get nice air movements, especially if the height difference is reasonably significant. The idea of this system is it works without the wind movement. You need to be able, in principle, to be able to keep these birds outside a heat stress situation in hot, humid, thundery weather. And so the design has to be built for that. There are models which can be done, you know, I can do, I still have those sort of models myself, we can work those sort of things out. The other thing is don't make it too wide so that the air movement you do have is able to get to the middle of the house. It's not a powered system, you have to rely on natural buoyancy, natural air rising, so you don't want to make the houses too wide. The other effect, of course, is the wind. A lot of systems like to use, or basically not like to use, but almost rely on the wind. And if you get a wind hitting one side of the house, you get a positive pressure here, and as the air goes over the top, you get a negative pressure, and so you tend to get a pressure drop, as it says, you know, across the house, and there then gets pulled through. So you can have stack effect from the heat, and then you have wind influences, which also helps air through the house. So basically, your roof is like an aircraft wing, and it wants to sort of take off, and so it's sucking air out. It's quite an important principle for. What you can get difficulty with is I think this is a halo. This is in the polytunnel type designs. Is that the side inlets are you only have side inlets. So this is what they call a pole bar effect, where you are relying on air movement or wind differences across the top to create negative pressures on one side or the other to move air through the house. There's no roof outlet, so in principle you don't get a stack effect in this sort of house. So if it's not too wide, it's not too overstocked, then these houses can ventilate okay in hot weather, and again the birds are probably more likely to go outside anyway, so you should be okay. But if in trouble here, internal recirculation is what we should be looking at. A quick talk in the few minutes I've got left on evaporative cooling. Evaporative cooling is obviously you cool the air by evaporating water, by having a high pressure misting system, and it needs to be a high pressure misting system to atomize water into the air. And for every 1 degree cooling, though, you get a 4.5% roughly increase in relative humidity. So the key thing with humidity, with misting systems, and again, it's probably a little bit, you have a bit more tolerance with it on a laying side than you would on a broiler side. But when you've finished cooling, those birds must not be panting excessively, because if they are, for example, if they were at 33 degrees and it's reasonably humid, and you cool it to 30 degrees and the RH has gone up, basically you're just creating a whole lot more stress on that bird in terms of its latent heat loss. It's that blue part of the graph. It can't lose heat efficiently into a very humid atmosphere. So you can create more trouble than you save. Where they are very useful is probably in the mid-20s, when it's perhaps not over humid, or if you cool it, let's say from high 20s, when I say 20, you cool it to 24 or 23, and the RH has gone up, but at 23 degrees those birds aren't really panting, then you have a benefit. Then you bring them back into good, to eating and good reproduction. So there is a benefit there, but it has to be carefully used. If you couple it with high air speeds, again, misting systems can take you from a point where, again, if you have a high humidity and you have trouble, you can, with high air speeds, because of the increase in the sensible heat loss, you might be able to bring those birds into a stable situation using misting systems, but you need to be very, very careful with them. And lastly, what do we at Draper do? You have to have a tiny bit of marketing. Basically, what we've tried to do is design a system which you get full recirculation of air in the winter time. So we're using all of that 160 kilowatts of heat that the birds produce in winter to rotate it around the house almost as fast as you would in the summer heat stress conditions, if you like, we have that ability. So you're always getting internal air movement for drying of litter. And we design the systems up in the roof so you get fast, very fast air movement in the ceiling and still quite good air movement on the floor. It's directly driven, but it's always rotating around the house. Is another example of the same system over a big Dutchman system. So we run high-speed air down all the aisles, for example. So in this schematic, you'll see high airspeed at the top, and it runs down the aisles. We bounce basically the air off the end, and that then, in a sense, becomes a little tunnel system within a localized zone. So you get bounce off there, comes back in the tunnel format, comes back under, in between and under a system. It does the same in here, it does the same here, and it does the same in the far end in these different zones. You can positive pressure the system, if you like, so that in sort of mildly windy weather or cool weather, you can actually just push out the air inlets. But in hot weather, we use negative pressure, so we pull air in. And in this system, we actually pull air right across the sheds across into these gable fans. So cold air in the wintertime would come in through these air handling units, we spin it around the house. In hot weather, when the pop holes open, for example, air goes out of these out of the gable fans, but we're moving the air around all and creating these little tunnel systems and also cross flow systems at the same time. So it's all about high air change is what we achieve in here, and getting in the system. This is just an example showing we don't have any sidewall inlets. And in these circumstances, we rely on height. Height is good in these houses. You can get good air movements. They're not so good for tunnel systems, but because we have these things forcing air through under pressure inside the house, height isn't a problem for us. In fact, the system. There's another example of how we've got multiple rows. We have a unit above an aisle here, and even if we don't, we can still get air down through these houses. So just to summarise then, we need to be specifying houses for the next 20 years. Remember that birds don't sense heat in the same way as we do. Then they're relying on their evaporative heat loss in hot weather far more than sensible heat loss. And that means they are very much tuned into what the relative humidity is doing. Airspeed then is king, it's critical to the core body temperature, it's critical to cooling in general through the wind chill effect. Thank you very much. Any other questions I'm sure about, or other strategies we might have during the course of the day, we can deal with in question time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good evening.